So let's push this concept forward and start to use Playmaker to build a state machine that allows for a game object to be picked up. This pickup concept is going to be a core concept it's going to be a core mechanic that we're going to utilize throughout the game design process. So in future classes, future projects, the idea is that we're going to run into an object, we're going to pick up that object, and we're going to modify an existing value inside some sort of a player manager to define and modify a variable that can affect gameplay. In other words, maybe we have a health value that we're tracking, and if our health reaches 0, we die and we have to respawn. And maybe we can pick up a health kit that will contribute and improve our health status. Or maybe we pick up a coin and it contributes to our overall points or some kind of currency that we're tracking. In addition to that, we could pick up items like a power-up or a tool, and it could modify the way that we play the game. It could add a mechanic to our game. So we're going to take this core concept and we're going to start by wireframing this idea on a simple cube. And you'll see that I do that pretty regularly. We'll start with just this wireframe concept, and we'll use some simple game objects to make sure that we get the mechanic right. And once we get the mechanic worked out the way that we want, or the rule for this object, and it functions the way that we intend to, we'll start to layer more mechanics or more nuance to it to make it more complex. And that could be, we could modify the visual aesthetic of the thing to make it look more like the thing we're trying to pick up. We could layer this into other more complex state machines or mechanics, as I mentioned, to influence the way that we can interact with our game world. So for now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take our original state machine experiment, and I'm just going to right-click and remove that component so that I can reuse this cube. Alternatively, I could have deleted the cube and just recreated it. And I'm going to move this cube closer to the ground so that I can interact with the cube and kind of walk into it. So right now, if I just place this cube closer to the ground, and I can tell really easily how far it is away from the ground based on how close the shadow is. So as I move that close to the ground, and if I start to intersect with the ground, you can see that there's this sort of green outline around the cube. We'll talk about what that means in just a minute. I can intersect that with the ground if I want to, but I'm just going to let it float just above the ground. Now, that green box around the geometry of our cube, or this cube, is the box collider. We have a box collider component, and the whole idea of a box collider is that when I hit play, I can run into this cube. Okay, I can jump on top of the cube. If I look down, I'm standing on the cube. I'll step off the cube. So this cube has a collider, and I'm interacting with the collider. There are two ways to interact with the collider during gameplay. We can have a collision event, which is what's happening when I bump into the cube. Okay, Unity's detecting I'm colliding with it and I can't pass through it. I'm jumping on it, I'm colliding with it. So we can have a collision event. Alternatively, we can have a trigger event. Now, the difference between a collision event and a trigger event, there's a couple of different things. If I go to the cube object and go to the box collider component, you'll notice that in the box collider, there is an element that says is trigger. If I check is trigger and I hit the play button and then try to interact with the cube, you'll notice something different happens. I can pass right through the cube, okay? I'm still having an interaction with the cube. I'm still having a physical interaction with the cube, but rather than colliding with the cube, I'm interacting with the cube as a trigger. So this is a trigger event, meaning that it will detect when I cross the plane of the collider, of this box collider, and Unity will track that and send an event based on that. But this kind of event is a trigger event. And really the big difference, as I mentioned, I'll just toggle the play button, is that a collision you won't be able to pass through the object. Okay, we'll actually bump into the object. And I'm going to utilize this trigger event for the pickup. So the first step in this process is to make sure that the cube is somewhere where you can interact with it. In the box collider component of the cube, I'm going to make sure that it is set to is trigger. Okay, so trigger is turned on, which means that when I interact with it, I can pass through it. Okay. Now I'll toggle the play button. Now I want to start to build a state machine. Our state machine is going to be a very simple state machine. So I have the cube selected. I'm going to right click and choose to add a state machine. State 1 is the cube in its resting state where nothing is interacting with it. It's just waiting for some user input. It's waiting for some game input. So I'm going to call this state 1, I like to call this state idle. If it's not doing anything, it's just kind of idling and waiting for user input. And it could be rotating, it could be moving, it could be playing sounds. There's a number of things that we could be doing during the idle state. But the idea of idling is it's just kind of sitting and doing whatever it's programmed to do, waiting for additional user input or additional input from the Unity game environment. So I'm calling this idle. I'm going to add an action, and the kind of action that I'm going to add is a physics-based action. So if I go into the physics category, you'll notice that there are things like collision event. Now I don't want a collision event because we've set our box collider to register as a trigger. And if you look down a little bit lower down towards the bottom of the list, there is a trigger event. If I double click and add that trigger event to my object, you can see that there's an event here that says once we enter the trigger or on trigger enter and we're colliding with an untagged object, we'll talk about tags in just a moment, we want to send off an event. Now we remember from the previous presentation that events are things that we name, that we keep track of, that will help us to direct traffic as we leave one state and enter another. Okay, so I'm going to go to my events tab and I'm just going to create an event called pickup. I'll go back to my state. I'm going to use the send event that I just created as pickup. And now Playmaker is telling me the event is not used by this state, right? Because we have not right-clicked and added that as a transition event or any global transition. We'll talk about global transitions much later. So if I right-click and add that event, that transition event, you can see that that first error goes away. Now I'm still getting another error on my state because this logic is not fully resolved. I'm in an idle state. Based on if I trigger this event, it's going to fire off a picked up event, but the pickup event doesn't go anywhere. So I'm going to add another state and I'm going to wire that state over. So I have idle, and if I interact with this object, if I enter the trigger, and as long as the object that's entering the trigger is untagged, it should fire this event. Now, as far as tags go, I want to point out there's a tag system inside Unity. I have my cube selected, and if I look at the top of the inspector, just under the name of the object, you'll notice that there's a tag system here. And in this tag drop-down menu, by default, most objects are going to show up as untagged, but there are some pre-configured tags here. And if I select my first-person controller, you'll notice that my first-person controller is tagged as untagged. Okay, so that's good. If I go back to my cube, currently it's saying this trigger event is listening to interact with things that are untagged. So let me see if this works. I'm going to hit the play button. And while I'm testing this, I'm going to pay attention closely to what's happening in my Playmaker editor window. So as I cross the plane of this cube, you can see that we fire this state and says, okay, we were picked up. Now the pickup doesn't really mean anything because the cube's still here. We just happen to pass through across the threshold of the collider, but we did get the logic to work. Our basic logic is that we're in state 1 idle, and then when we interact with the cube, it fires to state 1. I'll call this picked up. So this is when the object has been picked up. Okay, so I'll hit the play button again one more time and I'll test that. And it's really important that as we start building this logic, that we test frequently and methodically, and we're very pragmatic about our approach with testing. Whenever we introduce things, until we build up confidence with this process of Playmaker and with this logic, we want to test every step of the way. And if we break something, at this point, it's okay if we break something, just delete or remove the FSM component by right-clicking and just try to rebuild it. Worst case scenario, we can get rid of the object itself and recreate it. The experience of rebuilding something, oftentimes it's more efficient to rebuild something than try to reverse engineer some errors that are popping up. However, it is valuable to understand what errors are happening, and if you can fix them, fix them. If not, just try to rebuild it. So we have this basic logic of I cross my cube and we enter this picked up state. Now, one of the things that will cause this object to appear to have been picked up is if that we destroy this game object or eliminate it from the scene on the picked up state. So I'm going to go to my pickup state, and if I go to the game object category, inside the game object category there's a lot of useful stuff, but what I'm most interested in is destroy self. There's a couple different ways that we can destroy game objects, but I simply want to destroy self. And what self is referring to is the game object that this state machine is attached to. So logic here is that I've built a state machine on this cube object. It's idling and listening for a trigger event based on something that's untagged. If it interacts with something that's untagged, it's going to pass to the next event. And the next event says destroy self. Well, self is referring to the game object that this state machine is attached to. So let's try this. I'm going to hit the play button. I'm going to pass through the object, and when I turn around and look back, the object's gone. So the object's been destroyed from the scene. There's a few other cues that tell me that the object is gone. Not only can I not see it, it's eliminated from the hierarchy, and I can see that there's no longer a state machine down here. So I'll toggle the play button and the object reappears. I'll hit the play button. And again, I'll just select the cube here so that I can see this, and I'm paying attention to the state machine, and when I pass through the cube, it fires and does exactly what it's programmed to do. Okay, so I'll toggle the play button. That's the core concept for the pickup mechanic. Now, there's two things that I want to talk about. We'll cover this in detail in the next presentation. However, we've created this object, and we have the illusion that we're picking up this object. So it's laying there. We cross the threshold of the trigger box collider, and we destroy the game object. Now, in order to pick up this object, we want it to result in some kind of modification to our gameplay. And it could be something as simple as I have a health value, as I mentioned before, and I'm increasing my health based on picking this thing up. Or I could have a points value, and based on picking this thing up, I increase my points. So we're going to track that through variables, and we'll talk about that concept in the next presentation. Okay, but this is one half of the core pickup mechanic. This pickup could be health points, it could be a power-up, and we'll thoroughly explore that in this project and in future projects. Now, one other thing that I want to mention is this tagging system that we started to touch on. This cube is listening for a trigger event with objects that are untagged. Okay, and now if I go to my first-person controller or my player object, and I see that its tag is untagged, if I were to tag this with something, in this case it would be appropriate to tag it as the player. I'll go back to my cube, and when I hit the play button, we'll see that our logic kind of breaks down. I'm passing through the cube, and it's not triggering this event. Okay? And the reason it's not triggering this event is because this trigger event is specifically listening for things that are colliding with it that are untagged. And so if I click on this untagged drop-down menu, this will give me this list of tags up here. And I need to make sure that my player object is tagged appropriately. Now, the reason I would want to have my player tagged as player, as you might imagine, is that if I set this to player and I cross that threshold, now I'm picking up that object. Imagine if I have enemies chasing me, or if I have boulders falling out of the sky, or birds are flying around randomly, and a bird that I've programmed comes and lands on my cube, or a boulder falls from the mountain and hits this object. If those objects are untagged, and I'll just switch this trigger event back to listen to untagged to demonstrate this. Let's imagine that we have a sphere, or a boulder, or something that's going to be, or a projectile even. Maybe we're throwing some snowballs around our island. If I take this sphere, and just like we did in our previous assignment, if I go to Components, Physics, and I add a rigid body, I know that this object is going to fall through space. Well, if that sphere falls and crosses the plane of this trigger, If it's untagged, this logic is going to execute. So let's test this out. Let me hit the play button. I'll see my sphere falls through, hits that pickup object, and removes that object from the scene. Okay, so now if that were a health pickup, and that object was designed to contribute to the player health, because this object fell and hit the health pickup, it might increase my health. Now that could be a fun kind of thing to play with. Maybe I got to pick something up and throw it. Maybe this is a fire and I got to pick up a bucket of water and throw the bucket of water at the fire to put the fire out, and that improves my status in some way. You know, we as game designers, we design that mechanic, that interaction. But there's going to be a time when you want to control the kinds of interactions that happen. I'm going to go back to my cube. Now, imagine if I were being chased by a bad guy, and I don't want my bad guy to be able to pick up this health pack and contribute to my health or his own health. I want that to be reserved for the player. Or maybe this is a teleport platform, and by crossing the threshold of this platform, I can be teleported somewhere else. Okay, well that's going to be great, but if I'm not filtering for that, if I'm shooting projectiles into my scene or throwing snowballs, and my snowball hits the teleport, and that snowball is going to get teleported. Okay, so it all depends on how you have your logic set up, so just be aware that there is this tagging system that we can filter out the kinds of interactions that we want. Now, one last thing about tags is that these are pre-configured tags that come with the project, but we can add as many tags as we want. If we add a tag, all we have to do is click on the add button, and then we have a new tag field. And I can tag this object as me. I don't know why I'd want to have a me tag, but I have a me tag. And now when I go back to cube, if I want to tag that object with me, I could. I'll leave it untagged, and of course I can filter based on that new tag. So those are the basic concepts that are going on inside this basic pickup mechanic. In the next presentation, we'll translate that to some kind of appropriate health system or points. We'll do that in the next presentation.